do you mean you got a pass? I thought we had a deal. And finally, Jerry Wexler at Atlantic told us the truth, that Morris Levy, the head of Roulette Records, had called up all the other record companies and said, "This is my freaking record. Back off."
Tommy James started playing music when he was 12 years old, and the band that he ultimately fronted, the Shondells, is responsible for some of the classic pop songs of the 1960s, songs like Hanky Panky, Crystal Blue Persuasion, and of course, Crimson and Clover. But it was his relationship with Roulette Records and its owner, Morris Levy, and Levy's links to organized crime in New Jersey that made Tommy James' story so exceptional. We met him in the East Village in New York City.
Tommy, you and I are about the same age, and I was surprised when I was reading your
92.
book. That's right. Geez, don't even remind me. To realize that early in both of our lives, our tastes were very similar. It was strange. I was living in West Hyattsville, Maryland in the mid-'50s.
Right.
I was watching American Bandstand and the Milt Grant Show, and I really had the hots for Annette Funicello. This was you in Dayton.
Listen, it was, well, actually, I was born in Dayton, but I grew up in Niles,
Right,
Michigan.
okay, Niles, Michigan, yeah.
And small town Midwest, that's me. And I started watching American Bandstand, I guess about the time you did then. And so my tastes and my upbringing was very Midwest and very, I don't know if you call it conservative, you just call it kind of,
yeah, yeah.
I don't know, B personality, whatever you want to call it. And I, you know, to this very day, I'm very thankful to have grown up normal, and you know, in a nice little environment that I go back to all the time. I have a home back there.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
I do, and I love to go back to it. I've stayed friendly with many of my high school teachers, and the ones that are left, the ones that'll talk to me, and you know, have a lot of friends back in my hometown, and I love going back there. Population's about 12,000 people, and I just love it. I feel like I feel normal when I go back there.
I've talked to a lot of musicians over the years, and it's surprising to me how many of them say, guys who are our vintage, who say that the turning point for them was seeing Elvis Presley on Ed Sullivan.
Better believe
that
it.
That was it for you too, wasn't
Well, all of a sudden, rock and roll became a job opportunity at that point. And the truth was that I got my very first acoustic guitar the week after Elvis's first appearance, and my electric guitar a year later. So Elvis was very definitely the guy that everybody looked to. He was the icebreaker. He was the first one to do any of that stuff. And I've often thought of just how lonely an existence that must have been. Scary, really. He was very courageous when you think about it.
It's true. I was also interested, and again, this is something that I've come across a lot with musicians who've told me this when they're starting out, the number of them whose first guitar, acoustic guitar, was a Stella.
Yeah.
You're about the fifth guy I've talked to.
Is that right?
It's amazing. What was it? Was it just because they were cheap?
They were cheap.
Okay.
I mean,
yours was $17, wasn't it?
$17.95, and I could have got the $24.95, but we couldn't stretch the budget that far. So I got the cheap one, and it had the string, not a strap, a string going across. So you know you could really injure yourself playing this thing. But it was my guitar, and I was 9 years old. And I learned everything I could play from the radio. You know, I really had my ear in the radio speaker all the time, buying records. And I wasn't really a lead guitar player. I was a strummer to accompany my singing. So that's really what I wanted to do. I wasn't really interested in becoming a great guitar player, as you can tell by all my records.
It's interesting, because I remember back then, I bought records too, and a 45 cost $1. Seems to me. My allowance was $1.
Yeah.
So every weekend I'd buy one, and I can still remember the ones that I bought. Can you?
Sure.
What were they?
Oh, well, I started out buying, really putting my singles collection together in about 1955. I remember Wayward Wind by Gogi Grant. I bought R.O.C.K. Rock by Bill Haley. But then when I got a little more serious, The Fool by Sanford Clark, you know, a lot of rockabilly.
Right.
And stuff like Gingerbread by Frankie Avalon was a great record that I could play. It was 3 chords. and you know, Come Go With Me by the Del Vikings, which is my favorite doo-wop record to this very day.
It's a good song.
Yep.
Great song.
And so I was definitely a 50s, you know, connoisseur of music.
Yeah. So you, by the time you're 17, you're playing with a band, you're playing the Legion Hall, you're playing teen dances and stuff like that. I wanted to ask you about Hanky Panky, because I think the origins of that are interesting. You heard it third hand, essentially, from a band who'd heard it from somebody else.
That's right. And on weekends, I used to go to a little club called Shula's, which was, you know, I was underage and I wasn't supposed to be there, but they thought I was 21 and let me stay. And so I would catch the bands on Sunday afternoon. And they always had a group from around the area play. And I heard them play Hanky Panky for the first time. And I saw the reaction of the crowd. And I said, you know, that is amazing. Because you were always looking for these songs that would put people on the dance floor when you played live back then. And there were songs like Louie Louie and California Sun and you know, records like that would always just push people right on the dance floor. And Hanky Panky, without anybody ever hearing it before, put people on the dance floor, but they also requested it about a half dozen times. And so I saw that, and you know, the wheels started turning, and I said, we got to do. We had just signed a little label deal with a little local label deal with Snap Records, and we were looking for a first single, and boy, that was it. And we memorized all 6 words, and couldn't remember much else.
My baby does the Hanky Panky. Well, I got 7. Maybe I counted wrong.
Right. Okay. So anyway, we basically started playing at all our little gigs, and had the same response. And so that was our first record. Yeah. We put it out. This was 1963 that we recorded. It came out in '64, and I was at that point I would have been a junior. Yeah. And so it came out and made a little noise locally, and then died because we had no distribution. But we got on the jukebox.
But yes, you had a savior. This guy named Bob Mack discovers it, right?
That happened. Actually, that happened 2 years later.
Okay.
We were. I graduated from high school then in '65. The record kind of came and went. Did okay locally, but that was it. And so I graduated from high school in '65, and I took my band on the road. And we played clubs throughout the Midwest, Rush Street in Chicago, and all up into Illinois and Wisconsin. And we're playing in a dumpy little club in Janesville, Wisconsin in early '66. And right in the middle of my 2 weeks, the IRS shuts the guy down. He hadn't paid his taxes, and the police come in, raid the joint. He was, you know, they basically made a crime scene out of it, and we were lucky to get our equipment out. And we went back home feeling like losers, and the minute I get home, I get this call from Pittsburgh. Now that's how the good Lord works, because if I hadn't have been home, I would have never got this call, and you and I wouldn't be talking here today. That Hanky Panky had been bootlegged. This one copy ended up in Pittsburgh. They bootlegged it. They sold 80,000 of them in 10 days, and we were sitting at #1. Only in America, as they say. Maybe
and
Canada.
This is just,
maybe Canada.
This is just Pittsburgh, right? This is
Pittsburgh.
Just Pittsburgh, okay.
But it's a major market.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can't believe what I'm hearing, and so they wanted me to quickly come to Pittsburgh, which I did with the producer of the original record. We went there. I picked up the first bar band I could find to become the Shondells because I couldn't put the original group together. And we bought clothes and, you know, headed out to New York a week later to sell the master. Yeah. And that's quite literally how we ended up going to Roulette Records.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you about that, but as an aside here, the Shondells. Yeah. Totally made up name.
Well, yeah.
By you.
Yeah. Well, you know, I
Where
made
did
it up in study hall.
I
mean, it was, that was, I like it sounded musical. I liked the way it rolled off my tongue. We were the Tornadoes before we were the Shondells. And, but that was a very contrived name, you know. Shondells had an effervescence about it I liked. So, and anything with an E-L-L-S on the end of it was musical, was a possibility.
Okay. All right.
So that's how the name got on the record. And that, by the way, that's all they had. And so they tracked me down. I ended up in Pittsburgh. We got a new group and went to New York.
Okay, so you're in New York. You end up doing the rounds to all the record companies. You go to Kama Sutra, you go to all these places, and I think the last one you went to was Roulette, wasn't it? Morris Levy.
And we had a yes, by the way, from Atlantic, from Epic, from Columbia, and we were really, really sailing high. I couldn't believe that everybody wanted the record. So the last place we took the record to was Roulette. And, you know, we thought we were going to be probably with Columbia or RCA. And so I went to bed that night. We stayed in Midtown at the City Square. And I went to sleep that night really feeling great. And the next morning, about 9 o'clock, the phone starts ringing. And all these companies that had said yes the day before suddenly said, listen, we got to pass. And I said, what do you mean you got to pass? I thought we had a deal. And finally, Jerry Wexler at Atlantic told us the truth, that Morris Levy, the head of Roulette Records, had called up all the other record companies and said, this is my freaking record. Back off. And they did, and scared them all. And that was, so all, you know, alarm bells went off. You know, who is this Morris Levy? What is this about? And
but I guess at the time, I mean, this is the guy who owned Birdland. This is the guy who brought Alan Freed to New York.
He was his manager.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so he was very famous and very notorious, but we didn't know notorious exactly why. And so he had scared off the other labels, and that is quite literally how we ended up on Roulette. Yeah. And of course, what we learned about Roulette was that in addition to being a functioning independent record label, and a pretty good one, it was also a front for the Genovese crime family in New York. And this we learned incrementally, and who we were rubbing shoulders with, and this was the basis for our story.
Yes. Now, it's interesting because despite all of that, Levy was a guy who wasn't so, I was going to say he was interested in the music. It wasn't that so much. He was interested in the music business as a cash producer,
money.
Right? As a cash producer.
Yeah.
So as long as you could crank them out, you were his golden boy.
Well, you know, the thing of it was, at Roulette, it probably, in the end, was the perfect place for us to be. I really mean that, because even though getting paid was like, you know, trying to take a bone from a Rottweiler, I mean, it was not going to happen. We weren't going to get paid. Yeah. This was a mob label. But they left us alone. If we had gone with Columbia or one of the corporate labels, I can tell you right now that we would have been given over to a producer. We would have been lost in the numbers, and probably Hanky Panky would have been a one-hit wonder, especially Hanky Panky, a fluky record like that. And that would have been the end of us. At Roulette, they actually needed us. And so when we got there, it became clear to all of us that we were basically being given the red carpet treatment musically, that creatively they really needed us, and they needed a hit. They hadn't had a hit for 3 years. I think the last hit they had before Hanky Panky was the Essex, Easier Said Than Done, Walkin' Miracle, you know, they had 2 or 3 hits. And back in '63. So they needed a hit record. And Hanky Panky was perfect for Roulette. They sold singles, and they made Hanky Panky the #1 record in the free world at that point, you know, for the summer of '66.
One of the things I thought was interesting, one of the comments that you have in the book, a quote from Morris Levy, which I think really, and I think you probably pointed this out in the book too, really sort of told it all. When Frankie Lyman died, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, Quite a Fool's
We're on Roulette.
We're on Roulette, great guy. He dies.
Yeah.
What was Morris's comment to you about him?
Well, you know, he said, first of all, he came down to the studio that night. We were in the studio. And he came down, and the first thing he sees as I come in are a lot of pills. You know, everybody in the band at that point was, this is a couple of years into the story, but he grabs me by the collar. He says, "You're going to be just like Frankie. You're going to take this, you're going to be just like Frankie." And I'm like, "Okay, Morris, you're absolutely right. I'm quitting today." You know, so he...
But you were giggling through some of this,
well,
I think you said.
It's the truth.
Because you were a little stoned.
And so the point is that Morris, in his way, really cared about what we did, but for all the wrong reasons.
Right. Okay, speaking of the pills, I have this quote from your book. You said, you're right, somewhere during the frequency of recording, we all started popping pills, amphetamines to be exact. Somebody always seemed to have a pocket full of them, but I was the worst offender.
Yeah, true enough. That's all true. That's the only part about you got telling yourself with an autobiography. You really do. I was really very heavily into popping amphetamines, and yeah, they were very common, but they will really do a number on you.
And you got, at one point, you're describing about the period of time where you're taking pills, your marriage is disintegrating, and then you develop a fascination with guns.
True enough.
Which all sounded like Phil Spector to me. It was all,
well,
you were bringing guns to the studio with you.
I'm telling you, it was all part of the paranoia from, and the psychotic behavior of popping pills.
Yeah.
And so what it boils down to is that I was a pretty dark character there at one time for 3 or 4 years because, truthfully, what was going on? We've skipped, a kind of the incremental stage of learning what it was about and gotten directly to the problems, which I can only blame myself for. I don't blame anybody else. This was me trying to keep up a schedule. We were either in the studio, on the road, or writing all the time.
Yeah.
And we couldn't breathe. And of course, at Roulette, you also had to come up with 4 or 5 singles a year. Our release schedule was pretty amazing. Of course, the other side of that coin is that's why we had so many hit records.
Right.
So, Morris was one of the most fascinating people I ever met because he'd crack the whip and you kept doing things up there because you kept having to outdo yourself. But in the end, Morris probably did us all kinds of favors. I don't include popping pills in that. That was my fault.
And he was against that, as it turns
but
out.
Yeah. But Morris was the driving force behind everything we did during those years. Yeah. And I gotta, as Martin Fitzpatrick and I started writing this book, we basically realized Morris is the star of the show.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got to ask you about, because this was a passage in it that just completely caught me off guard. I didn't know about it until I read the book. You guys, the Shondells, basically became the house band for Hubert Humphrey during the '68 presidential election.
Yeah.
You were playing for him all over. How did that come about?
That was wild because we had been approached by the Democratic Party back in 1968 to play a Democratic rally in southern Manhattan where all of the Democrats were going to be. Eugene McCarthy was going to be there. The mayor of New York, John Lindsay, was going to be there. Hubert Humphrey was going to be there. 2 or 3 other Democrats, the governor that year, and I can't think of the name. But
it's okay.
But
you're doing way better than I am.
It was a Democratic thing.
Yeah.
So we performed and got put on a list of people who were willing to perform, and that year that had never happened before, where rock and roll and politicians teamed up together. That had never happened before. So we got put on a list, and all of a sudden, we actually, Robert Kennedy was there that year too. And we were approached called by Hubert Humphrey's office just before the convention and asked if he was going to be the nominee. They knew that already. And that would we consider coming out and playing some rallies? And we went, yeah, that sounds fun. So sure, we canceled a tour of England,
which ended up getting you banned on the BBC,
big
right?
time. We got in big trouble for that because Mony had been the #1 record that year in Britain. Actually, it was as big or bigger over there than it was here. Yeah. So they were really upset with us. But we figured it was more important to do the presidential campaign, which is what it was at that time. He was the nominee, and that was just something we felt like we had to do.
I thought it was interesting too that you say in the book that at one point every night after these things you would sort of get together with him, and at one point he started talking to you about his idea of doing a referendum on the Vietnam War.
Let me tell you, this was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And the funny thing is that it's all in this cocoon of rock and roll, but it was really an amazing moment. When we met up with him out on the road, we just liked each other right off the bat. And he asked us to do more and more rallies, which we did. And we ended up doing the whole campaign with him. We were sort of the opening act. We would perform, and then we'd sit with him and Muriel on the stand and sit there, and we sort of, I guess, represented rock and roll, right. And he was a hip guy and all that stuff. And so we ended up playing all over the United States with him. And at one point he asked if I would consider being President's advisor on youth affairs. And I'm going, what?
This is like Nixon asking
Elvis, right? And I said, well, believe me, the youth are having affairs. And I'm just the boy to look into. And I'd be honored, yes. And so my life could have taken a real turn at that point. One night he calls us up. We would get together at the end of the day. And there'd be this, he'd always have he'd have the presidential suite. And there'd be all kinds of people in there, whatever celebs had come along that night, and us, and his doctor was always there, and all kinds of interesting senators and congressmen would come. And so one night he calls us up, and he's like very serious, and he lays out this plan for ending the Vietnam War. And I'm going, oh my God, if the press could be here, or say, this is the real deal. And what he was going to do is have a national referendum, which was a vote on one issue. And he said, you know what this would do? He said, this would save 30,000 kids and end the war. And, he was dead serious. Yeah. And so I was just flipped out about all that.
I guess.
If he had been elected, I think things would have been a lot different.
Now, it's interesting, too, because, again, as a small aside here, you did help him with a small sleeping problem that he had one night. You were like you were like the pusher man to the potential president of the United States.
I gave him a stay awake pill.
Oh, it was a stay awake pill. That's right. Yes,
I did,
and he did stay awake.
Should have gone to jail.
And he did stay awake, didn't he?
He says, that damn thing kept me up all night. That's what he said.
We can keep you up for 4 years through your whole first term if you want.
God.
All right, tell me a little bit about, what I think is interesting at the time is that you recognized, you read about this in the book, you recognized that at a certain point music started to shift, and the whole pop top 40 thing was shifting now to album-oriented rock as it was, and all these bands that were in the late 60s that were doing all this stuff that you guys up to that point weren't doing. You recognized that was happening, right?
Right. Well, what had happened was that we made it at a time when singles were king, and basically they called it the golden era of rock and roll, when single 45 RPM records were really the state of the art. And it was all about AM top 40 radio playing singles. And as a matter of fact, when I got into the business, the business model was, when I first came to New York, was you threw out a single. If the single had legs, made any noise, you did an album. You didn't do an album until you knew you had a market for the single, from the single. Yeah. And you then released the second single and the album together. That was the business plan. And that had been the business plan really since the beginning of rock and roll. All of a sudden, that all changed. And it happened when we were out on the road with Hubert Humphrey. And we left, let me just tell you, we left in August of that year of '68, and the biggest acts on the radio were the Rascals, Gary Puckett, the Association, the Buckinghams, us, and I'm leaving a lot of people out, but singles. Yeah. And we came back 90 days later, and it's Joe Cocker, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Blood, Sweat and Tears, Led Zeppelin, all album
tracks. That's right.
And that happened in 90 days.
Yeah.
And I cannot tell you what an earthquake that was in the industry. And, you know, the point was that there was this mass extinction of singles acts at that moment, and they were all replaced with album acts. And it's amazing how that doesn't really get talked about very much. We were working on a little song at that moment called Crimson and Clover, out on the campaign. And we were toying with it. And we realized, by the way, that if we didn't sell albums, our career was probably over. And which we would have had a nice run, but we would have probably ended it with Mony, and that would have been it.
Yeah.
We made a conscious decision to give our best shot at selling albums. And we talked with Roulette about this and how important it was. And Crimson and Clover allowed us to make that jump from AM top 40 singles to FM progressive album rock. I don't think there's any other record we ever did that would have allowed us to do that in one shot like that. And so there was this big release of Crimson and Clover. It ended up being our biggest single and was attached to the Crimson and Clover album, and Roulette began really selling albums at that point, and we were allowed to continue. And there's no other track that I can think of that would have allowed us to do that and end up with another half of our career. Yeah.
Well, excellent. Listen, this is great of you to provide this time for us. I really appreciate it.
Thank
and good
you.
luck with it. We look forward to it.
I got to tell you, it's been
Thanks
wonderful. You crammed as much into a half hour as we could do.